Hello and welcome to Gendering Geopolitics, my short series where I have quick 10-minute conversations with women around the world doing amazing things. My name is Emily Prey and I'm a senior analyst at the New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. Today I'm speaking with Heather Barr, the interim co-director of women's rights at Human Rights Watch about Afghanistan. Thank you so much for joining me today, Heather.
Thank you.
So you've worked on women's rights in Afghanistan for the last decade. What makes you so worried about the current situation of women and girls there right now?
So there's a crisis going on, and it's an escalating crisis. If you had asked me that same question about 2 months ago, I would have said that I was deeply, deeply worried, and I was deeply worried about three things. One was falling aid money, which means that systems like education and healthcare are at risk of collapsing. Two is rising violence as the Taliban and the government fight. And three is rising Taliban influence, because we know that the Taliban still have extreme views on opposing gender equality. But I'm much more worried now than I was 3 months ago. And that's because the U.S. announcement that it's withdrawing its troops unconditionally, and the withdrawal that's actually moving forward has been accompanied by a rise in Taliban control that's much faster than anyone would have predicted. I think anyone who's an Afghanistan watcher would have predicted after that U.S. announcement that things were going to go in a difficult direction. But I think it's been a surprise to pretty much everyone how quickly that's happened and how serious the gains by the Taliban have been. And that raises another important question, which is, have the Taliban changed? Is there some kind of Taliban 2.0, which is different and a bit more enlightened on women's rights than what we saw from them in 2001? And, there have been some signs over the years that their rhetoric has softened. In Doha, when they were trying to appear statesman-like, they were, making it sound like they would at least support girls being able to attend primary education up to grade 6 and so on and so forth. But what we've seen in the last month or so, as they've gained control of more and more territory, is that it doesn't look anything like what they were saying in Doha. They're closing schools in many places completely, not allowing girls to go to school at all, not allowing women to leave their houses without a male family member, a mahram, escorting them. Blocking women from accessing healthcare even without a mahram, and there have been some killings of women. So it's a really, and also, sorry, I've forgotten about forced marriage. There have been reports from various parts of the country that they're also looking to force girls and women into marriage. So it's a really, really alarming situation at the moment. Thanks.
What are your thoughts on Biden's remarks last week, where he brushed off responsibility for what's happening in Afghanistan and didn't really want to answer any of the questions on the withdrawal or about the Taliban?
That speech obviously came after his comments a few days earlier, when he'd said, when he'd sort of shut down questions from journalists and said, "I want to talk about happy things, man," which just seemed incredibly callous and flip. And then the actual speech, once he decided to show up and, as he said, answer your negative questions to journalists, that speech was so frustrating. You could see that it had obviously been very carefully crafted. And because it's obviously been carefully crafted, I think we can discern from that speech what the US's messaging is going to be on Afghanistan going forward. And that messaging clearly is, we did everything. We did everything we possibly could have for the Afghans, for the Afghan government. We gave them all the resources. We gave them all the training. We did everything for them. And if things go wrong from here on out, that's nothing to do with us. That's entirely their fault, because all these resources and all the support we gave, they just aren't able or willing to make good use of it. And that's a completely ahistorical and disingenuous and harmful narrative. People like me who spent a lot of time working in Afghanistan know very well what an enormous role the U.S. played in creating the Afghanistan that exists today with all of its dysfunction, and particularly at the Afghan government. I mean, the US has been involved at the level of actually deciding who's going to run the country on various occasions. And a lot of the things that, we could point to and criticize about the Afghan government are things that in some ways were produced by strategic or unstrategic decisions that the US made. So I think that narrative is really frustrating, and it really denies a responsibility that I think that the United States has and will continue to have for what happens in Afghanistan in the coming months and years. And one of the points that we've been trying to make in talking to other governments is that there's a need right now for other countries who care about what's happening in Afghanistan to step out and be a counterweight to this US messaging and demonstrate that some countries really do care about what's happening in Afghanistan, including what's happening on human rights and particularly women's rights. Thanks.
So what kind of message does this send to America's allies in the rest of the world?
So I think we can think about, two different categories of allies. There are the allies who joined the U.S. after 9/11 and going into Afghanistan, and I think that I've spoken to some of them in the last few months, and I think they're feeling quite bruised. I think they're feeling like the U.S. has moved ahead in an abrupt way that not only didn't consult them, didn't engage in sort of joint decision making, but sometimes didn't even tell them. I've had ambassadors describe to me sort of finding out, major new U.S. policies on Afghanistan by reading it on the internet on a news website, which is not the way partnership is really supposed to work. And so I think that a lot of people are sort of saying this doesn't seem that different from how the Trump administration operated in terms of partnerships and allies. I think a second category of allies we have to think about are countries from the global south. And, people have been asking questions like, should any country ever trust America again after the way that they're, sort of disengaging in Afghanistan and walking away so abruptly. And one thing I want to talk about is, and you raised concerns about, what's happening in Afghanistan right now, about the Taliban gaining ground back. The response you often get is people say, 20 years wasn't long enough. Oh, do you want the soldiers to stay forever? Or, this war was always illegitimate. That we never should have gone to war in the first place. Of course we should leave. And I think none of those discussions are helpful at this point. I think it doesn't matter whether you supported the war or not, whether you think the troops should have come home 5 years ago or 15 years ago. I think that the key point right now is what's actually happening on the ground in terms of women's rights, in terms of human rights, and what can the world do to try to mitigate that harm, and what responsibility do we have to do so? Thanks.
So why should the U.S. continue to care about the plight of women, of Afghan women and children, when there are so many other issues competing for attention right now?
So two reasons. One is because, we've all been talking more and more in recent years about, governments supposedly caring about women's rights. Various countries have been talking about having a feminist foreign policy and so on. If we don't care about Afghanistan, then all of that rings very hollow. I was just on a part of another discussion earlier today where a colleague who's an Afghan women's rights activist described the Taliban's approach as gender apartheid. I think that's a pretty apt description. So I just think that, it would be really shocking if the US and other countries were ready to kind of shrug and say, oh, well, so it goes, in the face of a group that's imposing the kinds of abuses that I talked about a moment ago. So that's one reason. The second reason is, as I've already said, I think that the US has a responsibility to Afghanistan because the US helped create this situation. I think there are lots of ways that things could have been done differently, including the way that this withdrawal has been done. I think that even in the last 2 or 3 months, there are ways that the US government could have planned and thought differently about things. But I think they have a responsibility to specifically to Afghans who put their heads up and endangered themselves because they were asked to by the U.S. government, but also to the whole country, and particularly to women and girls. I don't know if you remember, but women and girls were really used as propaganda to convince American voters to support this war. And, maybe of course, it was never true that this war was about gender or about women's rights, but I still think that creates a debt which should prevent the U.S. from just freely walking away at this point. Thanks.
Absolutely. Words matter. And what the US has said in the past, I think that we should stand by that because that really says a lot about a country. I want to thank you so much for coming on to Gendering Geopolitics. It was an absolute pleasure speaking with you today, Heather.
Thanks.